Hello, and welcome back to the Video Essay Podcast. I'm Emily Coe, the associate producer, and in this episode, we are featuring Alan O'Leary. We had such a wonderful and fascinating conversation with him. We talk about his origin story, the Oulipian resonances within his work and process, more experimental and perhaps more vulnerable approaches to scholarship, and a whole lot more. Later on, we also discuss an excellent video essay by Kathleen Loock. As always, you can learn more about the podcast at thevideoessay.com. Subscribe to our free newsletter, Notes on Videographic Criticism at thevideoessay.substack.com, and please consider subscribing to the Video Essay Podcast on YouTube. Without further ado, let's get into the conversation.
And now we are so pleased to be joined by the one, the only, Alan O'Leary, scholar, video essayist, professor at Aarhus University, organizer, and we'll talk about this later, of some fantastic video essay events that have occurred online in the recent years, and someone who I've gotten to know, and we've been talking, we got to do a podcast conversation. So thrilled to finally be here with you, Alan. Welcome to the show.
Thanks a lot, Will, and nice to meet you, Emily. It's great to have the opportunity to talk to you both.
First question, obvious one. What is your origin story? What first introduced you to videographic criticism? What got you interested in creating video essays? And then were there any people, videos, things that were kind of key in generating this interest?
I mean, in terms of my origin story, my short answer is the same as the short answer that many of your guests have given, which is that I was lucky enough to get onto the Middlebury Scholarship in Sound and Image Workshop, so video camp. I was there in 2018, which I think was a very privileged year for us as students, because not only did we have Jason Mattel and Chris Keithley and Katie Grant, of course, but we also had Kevin B. Lee and Alison Dufresne were there as visiting mentors. So if you like, those three, Katie, Alison, and Kevin, as guest lecturers or guest teachers at Middlebury, represent different kind of dispositions towards the making of video essays. So it was great to have that diversity of approach and the different modes of video essays that they compose in their own work. So that was a really lovely experience, and I think it generated wonderful conversations and even debates actually among the cohort. And that was where I met people who have become great friends, like Kathleen Loock, who we'll talk about later, and Maria Hoffman, and many others. And in fact, we've kind of continued some of the cohort from 2018 Middlebury as a group called IVERN. So I'm going to try and remember what that stands for. It's the International Video Essay Research Network. And we've actually been working on a communal video essay that we hope to submit for publication shortly. In kind of deep time, I would say my interest in this form was born in my training as an artist. So before I became an academic, I actually worked as an artist and a stage designer. And I was very interested always in the relationship of image and text. In fact, when I was working as an artist, I used to work on photocopiers. And we're talking now about, the 20th century. So color copiers were very much in their infancy and prohibitively expensive. So we used to use photocopiers where every time you wanted a different color, you had to replace the ink cartridge and then put a sheet of paper through again. What this meant was that I had to think in layers if I was making images with multiple colors. And I think the timeline and tracks on a timeline feels very much like a similar way of composing, at least images, and also in its own way sound. So when I came to work, as I did for the first time when I was in Middlebury in 2018 with editing software, they used Premiere Pro there, it somehow felt very familiar. And it was also a return to a way of working then that preceded my academic work, but that had always informed it. As an artist, or as someone who had been trained as an artist, I was very attentive to certain aspects of, film and of the audiovisual experience. So that would be the deep time answer.
I love that answer because it highlights the kind of mechanical aspect of what we do in terms of thinking about the technology that we're using and how it is structured and laid out and how that might influence the art that is produced as a result of it.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, it's a theme we might return to later in the conversation, but musicians in particular who make electronic music will often talk about the affordances of particular softwares in terms of what they generate as music. There's a wonderful book called The Oxford Companion to Algorithmic Music, which has great material on this. And I think, Katie Grant, I think even actually in the interview that she did with you that inaugurated the podcast, talked about how she prefers to use, is it Final Cut rather than Premiere, because it has different affordances. And affordances are in a software or in a, as you say, a mechanism that you use for making are about what's permitted, but also how your work is constrained. So the work itself has a particular personality and character that derives from the means that you're using. Particularly if we think of the work that we're doing as a kind of material thinking, which Katie, I think, has taught us to do. So I think that's a really good observation. You asked me also about whether there was any particular video essays that had informed me, and the answer is kind of no. I think I hadn't seen any before I went. No, I'm lying if I say I hadn't seen any before I went to Middlebury, because we'd all seen some, but they hadn't necessarily impacted on me. Apart from one, maybe there was. I was working with a scholar called Austin Fisher, who's an expert on genre cinema, and he had done a nice video essay called Spaghettis in Translation in one of the early In Transitions. It was an adaptation of someone else's academic article, but it took very much an associative editing approach rather than a voiceover argumentative approach. And I remember finding it very striking when Austin presented it at an event in Leeds where I used to work. So that was probably the one that I had seen and had as a point of reference when I got to Middlebury, I think, yeah. But otherwise, I think I came to it fresh.
Yeah, I mean, it's great to hear more about your origin story in relation to videographic criticism, but we're also interested in your scholarly work that preceded your interest in video essays. How do you think that has influenced your work today?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually, because I was probably, as an academic, a little bit of a frustrated artist. having initially trained as that and having failed to make a living at it, as is often the case, but always having had the kind of art I was interested in was political. It tended to be kind of intellectual in its orientation, so it had a kind of a scholarly dimension anyway. So in my academic work, it was initially very traditional. I did my PhD on Italian cinema, and it was on the representation of terrorism in Italian cinema, particularly the intra-national terrorism of the 1970s in Italy. And then I went on to work on Italian genre cinema. And actually here is where I would pick a moment that feeds into the videographic work. I did a book, a long study, and then a book on a genre of films called the cinepanettoni. That translates as film Christmas cakes. And these were films that were released for a certain period in Italy around Christmas that were coarse choral comedies, often enormously successful and sometimes the most successful film of the year in Italy. But they were culturally despised. So no one had studied them from a scholarly perspective. Most of the criticism was simply dismissive. Oh, these are a national embarrassment and so on. So they were being watched by an enormous number of people, but then being ignored from the point of view of scholarly analysis. So I did my book, and I thought, how do I do justice to the status of these films in Italian culture? In other words, I can just say what I think about them, and of course I did that in the sense that I had done my research project and I reported my results and did formal analysis of the films, did a kind of a cultural studies account of them, and so on. But the second half of my book, I turned over to other people. So I thought the interesting things about, or one of the really interesting thing about these films is the pleasure and simultaneously the odium that they generate. So how would I encapsulate this ambivalent status of the films in formal terms? So what I did was I did all these interviews with people about the films, actors who were in them, directors who made them, producers, but then also critics, and then fans, and then also people who really didn't like the films. So I turned over the second half of the book to this dialogue about the films, which I didn't resolve. And the film ends with one of the critics asking me, but also by implication, the reader of the book, but do you like these films? And that's how the book ends. So what I was trying to do there was to have a form that did justice to the status of the films and allowed the reader of the book to themselves ask themselves the questions I was asking and to come to their own conclusions rather than me offering those conclusions and telling them what to think. I think that approach to, let's call it scholarship, informed my approach to the video essay, which, as Kevin B. Lee has described it, borrowing a term from Godard, is if it's a form that thinks, we have to ask ourselves, in what way does it think, or does it allow thought? So as this dialogue in my book was intended to facilitate, I think of the video essay too as a mode which can facilitate thinking rather than tell you as a viewer what to think. So I think that really fed into it. Apart from that, of course, there's the Battle of Algiers book, which I subsequently did, which we'll perhaps talk about later because it relates to my first published video essay.
That video is how I first encountered your videographic work, which was published in Transition, Occupying Time, the Battle of Algiers, and obviously has this relationship with a written text. And so could you just very generally describe what it was like to engage with a film, a canonical film in this way, and in two very different ways, and how each informed the other? I think the video was published before the book was finalized. Is that correct? Am I getting the timeline there?
The video came out in Transition in 2019. The book also came out in 2019, but the video certainly was finished by maybe October 2018. And in fact, it was developed initially at Middlebury under Katie Grant's mentorship. By the end of the 2 weeks at Middlebury, I had a kind of a first draft. There was a whole chunk of it not there. In effect, it was adumbrated. There was a kind of a sketch of the thing that I then filled in at the end of the Middlebury period. So it was developed through the exercises that so many people have discussed on your podcast, which is the Middlebury Parametric exercises. So, the Pechakucha, and then the voiceover exercise, then the epigraphic exercise. And then they also had us make, at the end of week one, a trailer for the film we would be working on subsequently. And Katie Grant looked at the trailer I had done and said, well, just use that, just fill it in. And I hadn't thought of doing that at all, but she was absolutely right. She spotted kind of a potential in the material that I had managed to develop at that point, which I then continued with. But the relationship to the book was complex in that I decided to work on the Battle of Algiers at Middlebury as my kind of key text. And just for those who don't know, it's a very influential 1966 film about events in Algeria between roughly 1954 and 1960, which is the Algerian Revolution that ultimately led to independence from France. It's a kind of classic of post-colonial, anti-colonial filmmaking and a constant point of reference in discussions of political cinema. It also does something very interesting with time. Its attitude to temporalities is very complex. And that was the topic of the fourth chapter of my book on the film. So I did a short book on the film. And it was a chapter that was causing me enormous grief. I mean, it was very difficult to write. And when I go back and reread it now, I'm still not sure I understand my argument in that fourth chapter. It slightly eluded me. It was slightly beyond my writerly or scholarly capacities to elucidate what I was trying to get at. But I thought working on the film in this way, or on in a videographic way might help me with that, which it definitely did. And what it did really was allowed me to translate some of my at least straightforward listing of the temporalities that the film evinces, the temporalities that the film deploys or discusses, translate them into this videographic form, retaining the kind of list format. The video essay has these title cards that name the different temporalities that are introduced. So things like history, chronology, and eventually revolution. But it doesn't offer a hierarchy. It's simply a list. So what you get is this kind of taxonomy that pretends but isn't comprehensive and just leaves it there. So it isn't a standard argumentative video essay, and it doesn't feature voiceover, at least not my voiceover. And it was quite helpful, if you like, for clarifying some of my thinking. And I think of it as sort of an adaptation of the book, or a small part of the book that I did on the Battle of Algiers, but also a complementary piece.
Yeah, I find it interesting. I feel like conceptualizing videographic criticism as a method to sort of think through film, or it sort of entails formal experimentation. And I feel like this connects to the title Uskal Po, which obviously has its connection to Ulipo. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Uskal Po refers to Ulipo. Ulipo were, still are, they're still in existence, a group of initially writers founded in France, in Paris in the 1960s, who wanted to investigate constraint-based, or what we would call in our world, parametric approaches to writing. They featured, very famous writers like Italo Calvino, the Italian writer, Georges Perec, Raymond Queneau, and various others. But Oulipo, which stands in the French for Ouvroir de littérature potentielle, which means workshop of potential literature, they issued this kind of call for other forms or mediums to adopt themselves parametric or constraint-based processes, and then to adapt the literature bit of the workshop of potential literature to whatever the other form might be. So I have this notion that we work parametrically, and I'm very interested in parametric work in videographic scholarship. So I thought, well, why don't we have workshop of potential scholarship, or USCOLPO?
Going off of that, you published Workshop of Potential Scholarship, Manifesto for Parametric Videographic Criticism. Could you please share with us the origins of this piece? What prompted you to write out a manifesto?
Yeah, so it has a kind of a double origin, I would say. One is simply that I was really taken at Middlebury with the parametric approach to, in this case, the kind of pedagogy of videographic criticism. So, Jason and Chris used parametric, as everyone knows now in the those who follow the kind of discourse and themselves produce videographic criticism and video essays. They know that these famous exercises have been used to teach videographic criticism, but then have also been used to make video essays that have ended up being published and so on. So I was taken with this, and I thought, well, is this stuff just for teaching you how to do it? And as it were, for taking away the anxiety that many scholars will feel when they have to move into a kind of a creative realm, or to engage in material thinking as well as prose writing? Or can it be seen as having, let's say, some sort of, I don't want to say deeper meaning. I think what I mean is a more broader application. And so I wanted to investigate it myself. I found it extremely congenial, because the kind of art that I like, people like Donald Judd, for example, the minimalist sculptor, or again, writers like Italo Calvino, or even going back to modernist literature, people like James Joyce, have always deployed these parametric or permutational or constraint-based procedures. And indeed, if you think of something like poetry, obviously poetry in meter is a constraint-based form of composition. So I thought, how can we theorize this in relation to our field? So that's what I was trying to do. So I wanted to make a manifesto because I know that some people are a little bit suspicious of it, or at least they're suspicious. They're happy enough with you using parametric procedure as part of the process, but not necessarily as part of the output. So a video essay that might take parametric form in its published, or let's say at least finished form, might be seen as not appropriately scholarly. So I thought, well, actually, I want to argue against that. I want to say why we should take it seriously as a mode of development of work, but also a mode of, as it were, output of the work. Now, the form of the piece itself, in other words, this article, Workshop of Potential Scholarship, as you say, is called a Manifesto for a Parametric Videographic Criticism, which came out in Nexus 2 years ago now, had a different, there was my ideal, or my intention rather, of arguing the case for parametric work. But then I also wanted to do something that was itself at least somewhat parametric in how I composed the piece. So initially I had done a 500-word manifesto in these 50-word chunks, so a very simple constraint-based piece of writing, which I submitted to the Cinephiles special issue on the scholarly video essay. But Alison Dufresne and Tracy Cox-Stanton, who were editing that, didn't think it was appropriate because it didn't explicitly define scholarship. And I think that was fair enough. I think it wasn't the right venue for the piece. But I thought, well, I've got this 500-word chunk of writing that I spent a long time at. I'm quite proud of it. What am I going to do with it? No one else is going to publish it. I had done 500 words because that was the little position statements that they were inviting for the Cinephiles issue. But then where else would I put 500 words unless it was as a blog post or something like that? So what I did was I kind of reverse engineered then the article. I actually used that as my plan and then had to write the article that those 500 words outlined. And that was extremely difficult because they weren't written as a plan for an article. But it was quite a useful experience because it was very Oulipian. I mean, it was very like what the Oulipo would do as a kind of exercise. They would come up with some arbitrary idea, and then it became about the hard work of making that idea into a body of prose. In other words, of somehow generating from the initial structure a work of the requisite form and length. So what you have there is an article that is in itself is in a sense kind of an awkward read for me, and actually I couldn't bring myself to reread it for this interview because it's in a sense pushing me to places that I wouldn't otherwise have been willing to go. But the initial map of the article meant that I had to go to those places and to write things that I might even be a little bit uncomfortable about saying I agree with today.
Well, that reminds me of the function of the word workshop in the title of the piece, right? It kind of hints to this kind of ongoing nature of your thinking. Was that kind of your intention for it?
Yes, I think that's right. It's process. And as you say, ongoing. So you're never reaching an end point. It's not that I have arrived at my position and now I can stick my flag there and say that, that is the end point. I think it's a register of work also whereby you try and push a thought to as far as you are able to push it, perhaps even beyond that point where you're sure of that thought, or where you might be persuaded by that thought, but that the thought itself is doing the dictation of what you have to say. Thinking of that thought, if you like, as having its own agency and you being a servant of that. So when I had this 500-word piece, which is reprinted in the article at the end, whereas actually it should probably go at the beginning because it was what generated the piece, that was then dictating to me, where I should go. And it's a point of arrival, but it's only a point of arrival in the sense of arriving at a train station where you then have to switch trains and get another one, It represents a stage in my thinking, which I've been trying to take forward with other work then, like the video essay we might discuss a bit later, Nebular Epistemics and so on.
Well, I was going to say, there's an obvious kinship between the two, and the body of prose, that word stuck in my head because in your video, we get your actual body rather than that. So we'll definitely circle back to this in a minute. Pivoting a little, you've helped organize a lot of online and now in person events, screenings, discussions related to videographic criticism, interrogating the modes of videographic criticism with Maria and Kathleen, who we mentioned earlier. I think sometimes the philosophy of those events and how they are formed gets maybe lost in the weeds by the amazing things that happens there. So I'd be eager to hear from you what you see as the kind of the importance of such gatherings and your philosophy as an organizer or a programmer of this. Like what is the function that you see them serving?
There are several functions. And I think you're right to talk about a philosophy because, or at least a set of reasons for spending a lot of time, which is very scarce in the academic world, and organizing these things. It takes a lot of energy. One of the reasons was, and this is a kind of an ethics, that when I applied to study at Middlebury, one of the things they asked was that you would communicate what you learned to others after the workshop. So, I have kind of felt that it was part of it was my privilege and my opportunity to study at Middlebury. I need to then do things to make that happen for other people, or at least to allow for situations where others can have the chance to learn and discuss. So that was one reason. Secondly, and this is something that me and Kathleen and Maria Hoffman discussed a lot when we were organizing the Interrogating the Modes of Videographic Criticism, the online event that happened in February 2022, is that we really wanted to involve people who were at different stages of their career. So we had some very senior people, but we also had people who were doing PhDs. We also had people who were, just as you've done with the podcast, non-academic or freelance artists involved. So we wanted to treat everyone as having an equal input and an equal authority to engage in the description of the work and in the debate about it. So those things were both very important. The third thing, and this I'm not speaking now for Maria and Kathleen when I say this, but certainly in my own, if you want to call it, philosophy of organization of things like this, is that, and I'm going to start in a slightly uncomfortable place, right? Because one of the things you have often talked about, Will, especially in relation to your work on the podcast and your intentions with the podcast, is the creation and cultivation of community. And I'm very suspicious of the idea of community. And I'll try and explain why. Partly this is kind of social biographical. I mean, I grew up in Catholic Ireland, where the idea of community was used as a kind of stick to beat people who were in any way different. And it was also a kind of fig leaf over all sorts of violence, abuse of various sorts, whether it was institutional or just out there in the streets. But it was really a way of denying difference and of erasing difference. And of course, Ireland has become a very different place in the years since, in a way that I feel as an Irish person amazed by and kind of very proud of. But I still wouldn't like to go back and speak about community. I think what I'm very much more interested in as a metaphor for the group of people who are concerned with video essays, videographic criticism, is to think of us more as a society, or even as an agonistic society. Now, what I mean by this is that we have competing priorities. Not everyone agrees about what work we should be doing. We can actually admit that there are competing priorities and actually debate those in an explicit way. And that's what I think I like these events to facilitate. A proper debate about our values and what's at stake, rather than pretending that we're all the same and that we have all the same interests, because we don't, I think.
I think it's a totally fair point. And I think one thing you point to came up during a conference in Germany that we were both at, was this idea wanting to stop what we sometimes do, and something that I often do of, isn't it so great what we're doing, how great we are, blah, 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 like that kind of thing, and to kind of really be self-reflective in a way that is most productive, because that's ultimately what's best for everyone else. And it's important to be very excited about kind of the trajectory where we're going. But I think that is what was one of the great things about that event. maybe communicated by the word interrogating in the title. But no, I think it's an important distinction. And I'm wondering, do you have, so I know that you're doing a lot of exciting things at Aarhus. What do you see kind of in that spirit, what function do you hope to play, or what role do you hope to have going forward? And because Aarhus is facilitating a lot of really exciting stuff.
So Aarhus has, the department where I am, has this tradition of short film production, and that has been, for a long time, been about fiction film. But I think the reason I got the job at Aarhus was to think about teaching something that was much more academic creative hybrid. I think of it as the creative critical in a kind of hyphenated term. So creative critical short filmmaking, which draws, if you like, on the essay film tradition, which right back from when it was first theorized, which is, I suppose you could say people like Dziga Vertov, but also then Hans Richter, who wrote the great, where he names the essay film or the film essay back in 1940 in this short little essay. He talks about it as a new mode of the documentary film, which can make use of all of the resources of cinema, including explicit fictionalization. And that is, an enormous permission for us as video essayists. I think it's like a genuinely exciting piece of writing to reread now. And that's what I teach at Aarhus now. So I teach short film production as well as standard kind of film history. And we're very interested in things like process-based filmmaking. So I forbid my students to write scripts, for example. Instead, they have to undertake tasks that generate a film, from which a film emerges. Rather than saying, okay, here's the film I plan to make, I'm now going to make it. Oh, there it is, it's made. They have to engage in a process that instead comes up with something that surprises them as much as everyone else around them. And this, of course, explains my interest in a film that we might come to talk about later, The Five Obstructions by Lars von Trier and Jørn Leth, which is a film about a kind of task-based approach to filmmaking. So the work at Aarhus then is one of those happy occasions where my research, my interest in process, my interest in experimental approaches to the video essay and in parametric approaches to videographic criticism can also be expressed through pedagogical experimentation with the students. And the institution appreciates that. It lends a sense of excitement for the students. And I should mention that we have Katie Grant as an honorary visiting professor. So she comes every so often to help us out and to teach students, and also to teach other members of staff, colleagues, about videographic criticism. So it's very exciting to have that association with her.
At this point, we want to transition over to talking about one of your video essays, Nebular Epistemics, a glossary, scholarship like a spider, or SPET. I love the title. So in this video, you sort of start off with a comment from Drew Morton about In Transition's peer review process. And so that's part of what inspires this video, or at least what initiates the video. Could you please provide more detail about the origin?
Part of the reason for the existence of that video essay is that I am actually in the process of proposing to Jason Mattel for his Lever Press series of videographic books, a videographic book called The Poetics of Videographic Criticism. So the Nebular Epistemics grows out of the Hanover conference back in November 2022. And what I did was I did a kind of quasi-performative presentation, which Will witnessed at the time. And I also witnessed other performative presentations at the event. For example, Ariel Avizar did this wonderful thing where he did a presentation in which he invented a quotation that he then based his argument upon, only to reveal at the end of his paper that he had based the whole argument on a fiction or on a quotation that he had invented. It was a lovely moment. So I thought, oh, there's something in this. There's plenty of moment here. Maria Hoffman also did something that was very performative. as did Juan Lamas Rodriguez. Even though his was a recorded presentation, it still had a performative element in it. And I thought, there's something in this. So rather than just say, oh, well, that presentation was what I did at Hanover, I thought I would work it up. And it was also an opportunity to take on ideas that I had been introduced to by people like Johannes Binotto in his work on embodiment, but also my partner, Marie Halliger Anderson, who's a filmmaker and dance artist. And she does, if you saw her work, you would say, oh, that's a like Johannes's work. She does a lot of work where she engages with screens, so her body is in front of the screen and stuff. So I wanted to bring that stuff into my work, and this was an opportunity to do so. So then I happened to attend this SCMS, Digital Humanities and Videographic Criticism, SIG workshop on publishing videographic criticism, where Drew Morton did a presentation on In Transition's peer review process, as you mentioned. And he says, oh, one of the forms that we're at a desk level, we're a bit suspicious about is the illustrated lecture, as if someone is just standing in front of their PowerPoint. And I thought, okay, that's a challenge. I'm actually going to do something that is basically an illustrated lecture, but make it formally interesting and make it fun, intellectually fun to watch and dynamic. And it was also, of course, that my own work is normally absolutely different to that. I mean, certainly my favorite of my own pieces is a piece called No Voiding Time, which is a deformative analysis, I suppose you would say, or kind of compression of Inherent Vice by Paul Thomas Anderson from 2014, I think. And that's highly abstract. It's a very experimental. There's no argument in it, and so on. So it's exactly the kind of thing that In Transition is also suspicious about, which doesn't make its academic or scholarly argument or credentials obvious within the film itself. It's a very abstract piece. I mean, the other thing to say about putting Drew, so I take this clip of Drew from the SCMS event and put it at the beginning of the film to kind of stage. I want the viewer to be alert to what I'm up to formally. So it really helps in order to, as a kind of epigraph, an audiovisual epigraph to the rest of the material. It's also nice, I have to say, to have Drew there, because I've never met Drew in person, but he's extremely courteous and a lovely person to deal with by email. Always when I've kind of encountered him. So I wanted him to be the kind of presiding deity of the film. The next person who's quoted in it is Adorno, who I always imagine as this, Theodore Adorno as this great curmudgeon. So I thought, well, we'll start with someone who's very pleasant, like Drew Morton, and then we'll have Adorno as so they're the two kind of presiding household gods of that particular video essay. What I wanted to do was to make what I thought of as a kind of modernist scholarship. Now, what I mean by that is that one of the innovations of modernist literature was the introduction of the unreliable narrator, whereby you as a reader are introduced to the events of, let's say, a novel through someone who you realize at a certain point can't be trusted, whether because they're ignorant or whether they're because they're actually actively misleading you. And I thought, what would it mean to have, as Ariel Lavizar performed at the Hanover event, a scholar who was unreliable? What does it mean to have reason to doubt the sincerity of the person who's presenting you the material? I mean, to what extent does scholarship as a mode rely on our conviction that the scholar themselves is sincere about what they're telling you? And I thought, well, what would it mean to quiz that, or to give material for doubting that sincerity?
It's sort of a next level thing, because I think another critique that's often levied against folks is that, it's not scholarly to be a fan, for example, or to profess your love for something, or to bring in the personal aspect to it. So this is just taking it kind of to a whole nother level in thinking about mode. And an essential aspect of how the tone is presented is when you are in the car with, I believe that's your partner, Maria, there. And so just on a very nuts and bolts level, walk us through how that came to be and how it was staged and then re-edited for the film and kind of its function as you see it in the piece.
My partner Marie is herself a filmmaker and dancer. No, don't worry. She and we talk about our work a lot, as you can imagine. So part of what I intended to do, and you just sort of gestured toward it in your comment just before you asked that question there, is bringing in the personal into scholarship, or bringing in those parts of the preparation for the work that are normally excluded from the final work. And in this case, I wanted to bring in some of that invisible preparatory labor that is normally, at least, invisible in academic work. And in this case, that labor is shared because I'm in a household where I have the good fortune to be able to talk to my partner about my work and get very, intelligent and astute commentary on that work. Now, normally you would say, you would put it in an acknowledgement, wouldn't you? Say, oh, and thank you to X. But I wanted to actually build it into the texture of the film. So what you get are recordings just done with a GoPro stuck on the dashboard or or little car. We go on we share a car ride a couple of times a week to go into Aarhus for work. So I was telling Marie before I did the Hanover presentation about my ideas for the presentation. And I was just recording the conversations because I thought something might come up. We might say something that would be interesting, who knows. So I was recording it on my phone, but I was also recording it on the GoPro. I thought one of these will work best in terms of the audio. And then I thought, actually, no, I want to keep these in. I want to actually build them into initially the performative presentation and then into the final piece. Also because the way that the GoPro framed the images could refer to a key point of reference that I allude to in Nebular Epistemics, which is the Stargate sequence in 2001: A Space Odyssey. So you get that moment where the astronaut is propelled through this abstract landscape, and then every so often you get these stills of his face in this kind of disorientation, beautifully colored images. So I thought, well, maybe I can enact the idea of being lost in this fog, this nebular epistemics, by alluding to these images, this classic film history point of reference of the astronaut being propelled through the Stargate in 2001. So it's there for that sort of reason. And I also want to say that it's also intended to foreground my own vulnerability as a scholar, as a thinker. One of the things we have to do when we do scholarship is, we learn to do this, as you're now learning in your master's, Emily, and you in your PhD, Will, to perform your authority so that people trust you and trust that you have the authority to make the claims that you're making and to perform the analysis that you're performing and reach the conclusions that you do. And this means often disguising your own vulnerability. But I wanted to keep in the first thoughts, me clumsily groping towards the beginnings of an idea, and keep that in as, again, that perhaps disavowed part of the academic labor that goes into the production of what is normally very polished, or what is like ideally polished work, or typically what you're aiming for is to make polished work. So there's at least parts of this video essay then that are extremely unpolished, at least in terms of both the quality of the thought, but also the audio quality too as well. I very deliberately constructed a persona who was an exaggerated version of me. I suppose, dialed John Updike has this great phrase where he talks about celebrity as a mask that eats into the face. And I often think that being a teacher is a bit like that. As you go on over many years, a teacher and, let's say, a scholar who presents in these public environments like conferences and so on, you become a version of yourself that is increasingly distant from the person you once were, but is also increasingly taking over the person you once were in a way that you don't necessarily like. You have to kind of exaggerate yourself in that sort of situation. Otherwise, you end up being a boring teacher or a boring presenter. So I was turning that up to 11 there, to use the Spinal Tap measure. Dressing a little bit like what I do, but again, a little bit more like what I do. I would never wear a turtleneck, for example. So I was constructing a persona who was a version of me, but an exaggerated version of me, and one who I slightly object to. I don't like that persona in that video. But I was trying to learn from the lessons of someone like Chloe Galibert-Lenné in her Watching the Pain of Others film, where she very deliberately constructs a persona and then challenges it towards the end. Kevin Lee actually at Middlebury, when he was introducing his work when I was there in 2018, he showed a clip of a presentation he did in which he at a certain point jumped on the table and then jumped into the screen. And it just really stayed with me as a kind of an amazingly vivid moment that it must have been for the people in that room, where he broke the rules, but was performing. He was projecting a version of himself. And so that's what I wanted to do there. Then the other point of reference, of course, is Swimming to Cambodia, the Jonathan Demme film, which is a recording of a staging of the monologue by Spalding Gray. So I saw this film many years ago, and it stayed with me as like a super sophisticated, very engrossing piece of performance. And I thought, I want to do something like that at some point. And I should say I signaled this allusion to Swimming to Cambodia with the music, the theme music in the film, which is in Nebular Epistemics, which is taken from the score for Swimming to Cambodia by Laurie Anderson.
That's great. I love how you talk about this balance between the performative dimension, but also showcasing the process that you actually went through. But we're wondering if you could talk a little bit more about this idea that we should be keeping failure diaries.
Yeah, so this is something that we talk about in the car, one of the car scenes, me and Marie. This is to do with treating the work that we do as videographic critics precisely as experimental. And if you're doing experiments, it means you can't be sure of the results. But if that's true, then you also need to be able to recognize when you're successful with the experiments. And in a way, the only way to do that is to note your failures. But failures then become an essential part of the process. If you're afraid not to be successful, that means you're afraid to experiment. That means you only ever reproduce what you already know. So a failure diary is something that would actually be very interesting for other researchers to see how you got to that point where you felt you were successful. When I shared the film Nebular Epistemics with Drew Martin to get his permission to use the clip of him, and he said he used to do this. He used to post everything on Vimeo, every part of his process, but then Vimeo changed the subscription system, which made it impossible to do this now because you have to pay too much money to get all the space and all the rest of it. But I think at some point, there'll be PhD students or researchers who will be looking at the work of someone like Katie Grant, in as much as her timelines have been frame grabbed, screen grabbed, to see how she got to where she got to with some of the work that she did. What were the things that she rejected? And knowing what someone, a practitioner as skilled and as achieved in the quality of her work as Katie Grant, knowing what they tried out only then to reject in order to get to what they then kept. That would be extremely interesting for understanding our kind of criteria of value, but also our sense of what was important at a given historical period,
So it ends with a videographic yodel as well, with dancing. So just please share anything about this.
I mean, it's certainly a moment of climax that replaces or that performs the function of while refusing to perform the function of a standard academic conclusion, where you summarize what went before. It's a culmination of certain formal strands in the rest of the video. And it gives you the feeling that it's been tied up in a certain way, but without actually resolving what has been preceding it. So, I mean, just to describe it, what you have there is on the soundtrack, a song by Fabrizio De André, who's a very important Italian singer-songwriter. In this case, he does this kind of mock operatic song, which ends with this kind of satirical yodel. So I kept the yodel. And I mean, it's really extraordinarily technically achieved, I'm sure, yodeling. It's rather wonderful to listen to, but also has a comic aspect to it. And at the same time, as you hear this on the soundtrack, initially you will get a definition of yodeling, which is partly invented, partly is taken from the dictionary, but partly invented. I talk about how yodeling is designed or a technique for signaling location in foggy conditions. And obviously this refers to the whole idea of nebular epistemics, the fog. And then you see on a screen a word cloud. So there's a word cloud projected, and that word cloud is made of material from the video essay, so terms from the video essay, more or less. So you think words like parameters, philosophizing. And then in front of that is my partner Marie, who is a dancer, as I say, dancing. My directorial instruction was to dance skeptically. So the idea was that she would offer a kind of different discourse to the highly verbal, highly analytical one that was being provided elsewhere. And in a sense, it's a kind of fuck you to the register of the rest. I mean, that's what it's intended. A gentle fuck you, but nonetheless, it's absolutely intended as such that she's performing in front of the screen. Of course, then I do all sorts of technical things with Premiere Pro and Lumetri color and all that in order to make it look like what it looks like. So instead of having a standard conclusion in which I would summarize and clarify my argument, I make the words that I was using into a cloud, which then refers to the theme of the video essay itself, Nebular Epistemics. And then I have Marie performing a skepticism towards the whole. And I agree with you. I think it works as a kind of culmination, if not as a conclusion of different strands throughout the video, because you will have noticed that there's other dancing going on during the video, at least on the screen behind. Partly this is taken from moments in the Five Obstructions, of course, or at least in The Perfect Human, which is the film that the Five Obstructions is riffs on. But then you see Marie dancing, and you also see at one point me dancing, even though that's mercifully brief. But I thought it was important, again, to kind of reveal the vulnerability of the scholar forced outside their, in this case, comfort zone, which is behind a table lecturing.
Thank you very much for diving into the weeds there on the creation of that video. We could have a million more questions to talk about. And again, for everyone listening, it will be embedded at thevideoessay.com. So I hope you will either visit it or revisit it again when we will link to it. But now we get to a really fun part, which is the homework that we gave you, Alan, for us, which was to select a video essay that you wanted to talk about. And we're actually kind of coming full circle a little bit because Kathleen Loock has been a recurring figure throughout this conversation at varying points. So I'll turn it over to you to kind of introduce the video and why you selected it.
So the video essay that I've chosen is called Reproductive Futurism and the Politics of the Sequel, and it's by Kathleen Loock, who we have mentioned several times, who's my friend who's at the University of Hanover, and who I met actually in 2018 at Middlebury, and this video was begun there. And actually at the end of the 2 weeks in Middlebury, I think she presented the first minute and a half, 2 minutes of what has ended up being a 13-minute video. I think it's an extraordinarily well-achieved piece of work. It's just a kind of superlative example of videographic rhetoric, which is really well-paced. It does lovely things with a kind of a cold open, I suppose you would say. It does that thing, and actually Drew Martin mentions this, just to repeat another name that we've had several times. He does one of the peer reviews in transition for this particular video essay, in which he talks about how it matches the aesthetic poetry of its source material. So it takes material from the original Blade Runner and then from Blade Runner 2049 and deploys that really beautifully with these superimpositions, juxtapositions, wonderful varieties of multi-screen and moving frames and so on to kind of make its argument and perform its analysis. But it does that thing that Chris Keathley says about Kogonada's What is Neorealism, which is that it effectively poeticizes its explanatory elements. So I think it's just a really well-achieved piece of work. And I think Kathleen has just a wonderful sense of these things. You know, she makes a very complex argument, which I'll mention in a moment because it's kind of important to what I want to say about it. But she does so at a pace that's very calm. There's no sense of rush at all. And she's borrowing something of the kind of meditative, immersive experience of the Blade Runner films. And she uses the music from those films really well in order to underscore the placing of quotation on screen, for example. The music interacts with the voice really nicely. And I could go on about the different techniques that she uses, but I would just invite, you know, viewers or listeners to the podcast to take a look at the film itself to witness its sophistication, really, and its wonderful, wonderfully effective rhetoric. So, all of this, however, is to preface a kind of but, so a kind of however in what I want to say. At Middlebury, me and Kathleen, I suppose you would say we began a discussion between ourselves. I mean, the discussion was already existing in the world at large, but inaugurated a discussion between ourselves about what form videographic criticism should take and the relative importance of argument and, let's call it, poetic elements or indeed more abstract elements. And I remember actually we discussed earlier my article, Workshop of Potential Scholarship. I remember when Kathleen read that, her response was extremely articulate, and to summarize it, it was basically WTF. You know, what the hell are you on about, Alan? You know, what you're saying here about scholarship doesn't seem to be persuasive. It seems too far away from what it is we have been taught to do. And that, I mean, obviously, as she feels, what we should be doing. So she's adapting an article that I think she had already published on Blade Runner and the nature of, you know, what it means to make a sequel to a film that was not designed to have a sequel. The point about the original Blade Runner is that they're all going to die. But the sequel has to somehow manufacture a future for these characters, or at least a kind of legacy. And in fact, she uses the term legacy quill rather than sequel. So Kathleen does this lovely thing where she borrows theory from queer theory from a commentator called Lee Edelman, who has this notion of reproductive futurism, which she alludes to in the title of her video essay. What Lee Edelman does in his work is he talks about how the child, the figure of the child, figure in the sense of metaphor or symbolic image, set of notions or image, is used to ratify, by talking about our responsibility to the future, the kind of inequities or of the status quo. The figure of the child is used to exclude certain forms of life. So you can see it, for example, in Ron DeSantis's Don't Say Gay bill currently. The figure of the child there is used to be, you know, just radically oppressive of forms of life, of saying that you cannot live like this if you're gay, or if, you know, there's this hysteria currently about drag queen story time, and this notion that somehow our children are at risk if they're exposed to people who don't perform their gender in a cisgender way and all this sort of stuff. And this uses the figure of the child as this vulnerable creature to whom we have responsibility in order to insist that the world must not go a certain way. So it's a kind of responsibility to the future. And Kathleen uses this notion of reproductive futurism and the figure of the child to make a very sophisticated and I think persuasive argument about what Blade Runner 2049 does with the figure of the child and with the idea of reproductive futurism. So I really like it. I think the argument is really powerful. I think it's very sophisticated rhetorically, and yet I'm very frustrated by the film. And In fact, something like Nebular Epistemics, my own video essay, is designed to challenge or to ironize the kind of authority that Kathleen performs in this film, in Reproductive Futurism and the Politics of the Sequel. So she has her voiceover, which is beautifully done, beautifully paced. She uses her own voice, so she uses her own German accent, but it doesn't admit of doubt. She disguises the kind of vulnerability that I wanted to foreground in something like Nebular Epistemics. She's performing herself, but in a way that, as it were, I think effaces the disconnection between, the person of the scholar and the performance of the scholarship, or the performance of the authority of the scholar. So I'm very suspicious of its sophisticated rhetoric, ultimately. Even though I'm persuaded by its argument, I really wanted to have in there some semblance of doubt about its own argument, some sense that, things might be otherwise. And I say this seems to me very important because ideally Kathleen would be able to respond to this, but there's a sense in which this inadmission of doubt is a kind of a domestication of the queer theory that she's using. I mean, the point is, if you read Lee Edelman, it's very funny, right? And I have to read you a quotation from what he says. He says at one point, he goes off into this kind of peroration. He says, "Fuck the social order and the child in whose name we're collectively terrorized. Fuck Annie," meaning, tomorrow, that Annie. Fuck the waif from Les Miserables. Fuck the poor innocent kid on the internet, and so on. Fuck the whole network of symbolic relations and the future that serves as its prop. I mean, I find this stuff very amusing, very hilarious. It's designed to be provocative, but also to entertain. And it's also designed to, as it were, go beyond the point of being persuasive. It is intended to, as it were, provoke opposition. So I kind of feel that in the mode of this video essay, which is superlatively achieved, incredibly sophisticated, it domesticates the grit or the challenge of the kind of texture, the rhetoric of the scholarship that it's drawing on. Now, as I say, I wish Kathleen was here to respond to this, but I chose this video essay precisely because it is such a good example of a mode that I'm suspicious of, and that in my own work, I want to ironize even as I admire it.
Well, thank you for that. And I think this is a great example of that videographic society, right, that we talked about earlier. I think, yes, there's a lot at play here. One thing that as we make our way into everything that you've just said, and thank you again for that, I'm wondering what you make of, well, you mentioned a little bit in referring to Drew's comment in the peer review. I first saw this video essay when Kathleen screened it in fall of 2019 at an event that Katie Grant organized at Birkbeck. And I remember being struck and getting to see it on the big screen, which I think was a tremendous experience, given the fact that we're working with the kind of these beautiful, rich images from a contemporary film, high resolution and the like. And I think what it made me realize was that I feel like up until that point, I had always thought that high resolution images like that somehow made the work of videographic criticism easier, or that they afforded a richness that you could just kind of more easily borrow to kind of capture the viewer. But I actually found that in watching this video that in a lot of ways it was the opposite, that you have to manipulate the image in such a way that maintains or engages in some way with the materiality of the images that you're appropriating. And I think this piece does that very well. And I really appreciate the way in Kathleen, how she deals with time and her willingness to kind of let clips play and to kind of let it breathe and to borrow, as you say, that immersive quality and beauty in it that she then deconstructs in a scholarly, very rich, or maybe rich isn't the right word, but it's very sophisticated, I guess, would be the argument. And I think we are very, and maybe this is what you're suspicious of, we are welcomed into that by way of her treatment of the images and letting us breathe and capturing their own beauty, for lack of a better word.
What she does extremely well is that she makes manifest the seduction of the films, particularly of, she's critiquing in particular the second one. She allows us to feel the pleasures of those films in order then to take our distance from that pleasure. And I mean, that's an extremely powerful technique, and I think she does it with great skill. But what I feel, if I were making the video, and I should say that I'm really glad that this film exists, that Kathleen's video essay exists, and in the form it does, and in the degree of achievement that it has managed. But I want to resist precisely the seductions of this video essay in the way that she wants to resist the seductions of Blade Runner 2049. She's allowing us an immersion. She's mimicking the aesthetic of the original in wonderfully powerful ways, allowing us to feel the seduction of those and the pleasures of those original films in order then that she can critique those seductions and pleasures. And I think that's absolutely valid, and I admire it, and I aspire to doing something similar. But what's not deconstructed, or what's, to use the word you used there, Will, or what's not ultimately critiqued is her own kind of rhetorical appeal, the seductions of her own form.
Yeah. I'm going to ask this, and I don't mean this in a leading way. So let me preface by saying that. Does it need to acknowledge that, in the sense that we know that, as a video essayist, you're referring to it as a film, as a work of art that will then be interpreted and deconstructed and criticized in a I don't mean like in a negative way. I mean like as, a function as film criticism. So does Kathleen need to engage with that in the body of the video itself, or can that just be part of its own afterlife, in the same way that there's the seductive quality to the film?
I mean, the answer is, of course, she doesn't have to make it clear within the film. It's a choice. And the point is, it is an adaptation of a particular form of academic discourse, which then very, almost in a virtuoso way, deploys the resources of the videographic. So, but for me, what makes the videographic interesting, and I think Katie Grant talks about this too, is that it may be I'm borrowing now a phrase of Katie's that I use in Nebular Epistemics. It may be an ontologically new scholarly form that then makes us reconsider the kind of priorities, standards, protocols of prose scholarship that we had grown to take for granted. So what I'm saying is that this film, Kathleen's video essay, is absolutely perfectly achieved within its own terms, but I want to challenge those terms. So, of course, she shouldn't turn around and deconstruct the seductiveness of her own argumentative and rhetorical procedures, because that's not the sort of work that she's doing. But I think it's important for those of us out there in the videographic agonistic society to be resistant to those seductions and to frame them critically and to say, look, this argumentative form is itself ideological, I suppose, in the way that she's saying that the techniques, the deployment of reproductive futurism in the sequel to Blade Runner is ideological. So I don't think, in other words, that we should be naturalizing by reference to, let's say, scholarly protocols that have been derived from, a century of prose scholarship, that we should be naturalizing those standards and protocols in this new environment. But one of the things that I talk about in Workshop of Potential Scholarship is how we've come to a point in universities, in institutional contexts, where we're forced to think of ourselves as knowledge producers. And one of the things that we're supposed to produce are arguments. What I'm suspicious of here is precisely the fact of the persuasiveness of the argument. It's simply too neat when the theory she's drawing on is deliberately messy. There's Lee Edelman stuff. It's very porous. It's very performative, gestural. It wants to undo the kind of epistemologies that I think actually Kathleen might be performing in the video essay. I want to make a claim for a form of work that has less status. I think this is a high status work, what she's made. This kind of argumentative in the academic sense of, performing an argument, offering its analysis and evidence and conclusions in a persuasive way. This is a high status form of work. And it's the kind of work that is necessary to produce, for example, for reasons of publication in certain contexts, not necessarily in transition, but certainly elsewhere, and to be taken seriously in institutional contexts for purposes of tenure or promotion and so on. But there's different forms of work which are much less certain of their own, are much less convinced, I suppose, of the arguments that they wish to make, if they wish to make them at all, that parade their vulnerability, that wish to go beyond precisely that point of being able to be persuasive or to be able to be convinced about one's own position, to go, if you like, beyond the evidence to somewhere a bit more nebulous or nebular. That is much harder to defend in institutional context. So it's much lower status in that sense. So what I'm doing here is offering a really, really good example of a particular sort of high status work that is obviously excellent. And trying to say, okay, it's obviously excellent, but I don't want to be persuaded by this. I think there's other ways to do work that need to claim their own validity and legitimacy.
Earlier in the conversation, we talked about endings and ending with thought and questions and ways to keep the conversation going. So I think, Alan, this is a great place to kind of end our conversation. And hopefully we'll get the chance to talk to Kathleen sometime down the line on this podcast, and we can keep it going then. So, but Alan, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you both for such really astute questions. It was a really nice conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Video Essay Podcast. The Video Essay Podcast is hosted and produced by Will DeGravio. I edited today's episode. Music by Ketza. Learn more at thevideoessay.com. Thanks.